She was abandoned in a forest by the man she loved, left without her wheelchair, her meds, or hope. But what he didn't expect was that she would survive and come back stronger than ever. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and justice that will leave you speechless until the final moment. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that could change how you see strength, love, and survival. It was supposed to be a good day. The morning air had that crisp, clean scent that hinted autumn was on its way, the kind of day Claire used to love before everything changed. Before the accident, before the wheelchair, before Grant Morgan, the man she married 12 years ago, stopped looking at her like a partner and started seeing her as a project, one he couldn't wait to abandon. He had kissed her forehead that morning, a gesture so mechanical it left more chill than warmth, and told her to get ready for a surprise. It was the first time in months he'd initiated any plan with her that didn't involve medication schedules, doctor appointments, or awkward family dinners where everyone tried not to talk about her disability. So Claire had allowed herself a sliver of hope, and that hope bloomed dangerously in her chest as Grant wheeled her out to the SUV just before dusk. "Dress warm," he had said with a half smile. "Where we're going, it gets chilly." She noticed the way he folded the blanket over her lap. Efficient, not tender. The way his hands trembled slightly when he loaded her wheelchair into the back of the car. Something felt off. But Claire had long learned to silence the voice in her head that raised alarms. Too many times she'd mentioned a bad feeling only to be told she was imagining things, or that it's probably just the meds talking. So she stayed quiet. They drove in silence, the radio off, the trees blurring past as the sun dipped lower behind the Massachusetts hills. As they turned off the main road and onto an old Forest Service path, narrow and lined with gnarled trees, Claire's fingers curled around the blanket on her lap. "Grant," she said cautiously, "where exactly are we going?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "Somewhere peaceful." The road grew rougher, and the SUV bounced over stones and roots. Claire's heart pounded. "This doesn't feel right," she said, more to herself than to him. "Just trust me for once, Claire," he snapped. Always with the questions. That was the first time her fear rooted deep. She turned to look at him fully. This wasn't the man who'd held her hand during her spinal surgery. This wasn't even the man who used to cook her pancakes on Sunday mornings in their Boston brownstone apartment. No, this man had a different look in his eyes, calculating, cold. When they finally stopped, it was in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by towering pines, no cabins, no paths, no signs of human life, just silence, so deep it pressed in on her chest. "Grant?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "What are we doing here?" He turned off the engine, sat for a moment with both hands gripping the wheel. Then he exhaled slowly and turned to her. "I've tried," he said, his voice low, clipped. "God knows I've tried. But this isn't the life I signed up for." Her throat tightened. "What are you talking about?" "I can't do it anymore," he continued, almost like he was reciting something rehearsed. "The hospital bills, the late nights, the way everyone looks at us with pity. You're not the woman I married, Claire. You know it. I know it." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "So what? You brought me out here to, talk, end things? You could have done that at home." He opened the car door without answering, walked around, and began unloading her wheelchair from the back. When he came to her side and unbuckled her seatbelt, her entire body tensed. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he muttered. "Grant, no, you're scaring me." Her voice cracked. "Please." He didn't meet her eyes as he lifted her out and placed her in the chair. Her purse was tossed onto her lap. A duffel bag followed, landing at her feet with a soft thud. "There's a flashlight, water, and a blanket in there," he said, still avoiding her gaze. "You'll be fine. Someone'll find you, maybe." Her breath came fast and shallow. "You can't just leave me here." "I already have," he said quietly, and something inside her broke. She started to cry, no, to plead. "We can fix this. Whatever's broken, we can fix it. Please, Grant, don't do this." He stared at her for one long second, and for the briefest moment she thought he might crack. Then his phone buzzed. He checked the screen, and a smile, not kind but smug, tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Rachel's waiting. We're starting over, Claire, without you." Rachel. The name hit her like a slap. His assistant, of course. And then, just like that, he turned and walked back to the SUV. Slammed the door, reversed. The red taillights flickered through the trees, then vanished. She was alone. The forest swallowed the sound of the car, and for a moment, Claire couldn't breathe. The wind rustled the branches overhead. A few birds chirped like nothing was wrong. She turned on the flashlight with trembling hands, casting a small, quivering beam into the darkness. The ground was uneven, cluttered with sticks and roots. Her wheelchair wasn't built for this. No. No, 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 she whispered, gripping the wheels. This isn't happening. He's coming back. He has to come back. But he didn't. And as the first real tears streaked down her face, Claire understood. Her husband had left her here to die. Not from violence, not from rage, from inconvenience. From inconvenience disguised as kindness, wrapped in a blanket and dumped in a forest like unwanted furniture. She screamed, loud as she could. Her voice echoed back at her through the trees and then faded. Nothing answered, no headlights, no footsteps. Just the creeping cold and the knowledge that the man who once vowed to love her through sickness and health had decided she wasn't worth the trouble anymore. And somewhere, deep in that forest, another set of eyes had been watching the whole thing unfold. The forest was never truly silent. Claire realized that quickly. It breathed. It shifted. It whispered in ways that made her skin crawl. Crickets sang their endless rhythm. Leaves rustled as if something unseen moved just beyond her light's reach, and twigs snapped like soft bones underfoot. But none of it made her feel less alone. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the small flashlight Grant had left her. It barely pierced the darkness, casting a narrow circle of light that only reminded her how deep the blackness around her stretched. She turned the beam left, right, then behind her. Nothing but trees, their trunks like pillars rising into oblivion. She tried to wheel herself forward in what she prayed was the direction of the road. But the wheels caught almost immediately on a root, jerking her sideways. The chair tilted dangerously. She flailed, heart hammering, and managed to steady herself before tipping over completely. Claire took a shaky breath. "You can do this," she whispered. "You've done harder things." But had she? She'd rebuilt her life after the accident, sure. Physical therapy, pain management, fighting for scraps of independence while Grant slowly drained her spirit. But she had always done it under the illusion that someone, anyone, had her back. Now, that illusion was shattered. She was a woman in the woods, alone in a chair that couldn't carry her through dirt and deadfall. And the one man she thought she could count on had driven away without a second look. Her throat burned as the cold air settled deeper into her lungs. The blanket he left barely covered her lap, and her legs, numb from the waist down, offered no signal to warn her of just how cold she was becoming. She checked her phone again. No service. Of course. Typical, she muttered. Out of all the places. The silence that followed her voice felt too loud, like the trees were listening. Her thoughts spiraled. If morning didn't come soon, the temperature could drop to dangerous levels. She hadn't had her medication since breakfast. Her back ached, her bladder throbbed uncomfortably, and the tightness in her shoulders had started to form a dull gnawing pain that only got worse with panic. She didn't know how long she could hold out. And that was when her mind betrayed her. It took her back, to the accident, to the sound of glass shattering, metal twisting, to the moment she'd realized she couldn't move her legs. The paramedics shouting, the lights, the smell of gasoline and blood. But worse than all of that was the day she came home from rehab and realized her marriage had changed. At first, Grant had played the role of devoted husband perfectly. Friends visited. He brought her tea, fluffed her pillows, posted long-winded tributes on social media about strength and God's plan. But when the door closed and the lights went out, the truth came in. She remembered how he started sighing when she needed help getting into bed. How he avoided looking at her when she dressed. The way he flinched when she asked if they could still be intimate, as if she'd asked him to carry her through fire. Eventually, the help became control. He changed the passwords to their bank accounts to make it easier. He answered calls from clients to give her a break. He started making her feel like a guest in her own business. Claire shook the memory off and focused back on the present. The forest, the dark, the cold. She moved her chair again, inching forward, every root a mountain, every branch a battle. She thought about trying to scream again, but what was the point? Who would hear? The nearest road was probably a mile off, and Grant had made sure it was one few people used after sunset. Still she tried. "Help," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Is anyone out there?" Only the wind answered. She started to cry, the kind of silent sobs that didn't ask for attention. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and the tears stung her face with the cold. She didn't want to die. Not like this. Not discarded like garbage in a place where no one would find her until it was too late. What would the headline be? "Disabled woman found dead in forest, possible suicide"? God, he would spin it like that, wouldn't he? He'd tell the police she'd been depressed, that she asked for space, that maybe she just needed time alone, and they would believe him, handsome, charming Grant, the grieving husband. Meanwhile, she'd become a footnote, a tragedy. "What a shame," whispered over coffee. A crack echoed in the woods. Claire froze. Not an animal. That was a footstep. She swung the flashlight toward the sound, heart thundering in her chest. "Hello," she called, voice quaking. "Who's there?" No answer. But she heard another crunch. Leaves. Heavy tread. Her mouth went dry. Was it Grant again? Had he come back, regretful, or worse, furious that she might have survived long enough to tell someone? "Grant," she called. "Is that you?" Still nothing. Then, a shadow. Large, moving between trees, coming closer. Claire backed the chair up instinctively, heart slamming against her ribs. The light trembled in her hand as she aimed it ahead. "Please," she whispered, "please don't let this be worse." And then, a voice. Claire? A man's voice. Steady. Familiar. She blinked, and the light caught his face. Strong jaw. Hood pulled low. But when he stepped into the beam, her heart jolted. Luke? Luke Bennett, her ex, her college boyfriend. The man she hadn't seen in over a decade. He looked older, broader, sharper somehow, like life had whittled him into someone tougher, someone built for the kind of night she was having. But those eyes, those impossibly calm, steady eyes, hadn't changed. He crouched low beside her wheelchair, his brow furrowed. "Are you hurt?" Claire opened her mouth. No sound came. Her mind reeled. "What? How are you? What are you doing here?" "I followed you," he said plainly. "I saw Grant load you into the SUV earlier. Something didn't feel right. I kept my distance. I wasn't sure what I'd find out here. But then I saw him leave, and I saw you alone." Her lip trembled. "He left me, Luke. He left me to die." "I know," he said, gently placing a blanket around her shoulders. "I saw." And that was when the dam inside her broke. Not from the cold, not even from the fear, but from the relief of not being alone anymore. Luke looked at her with that same steadiness he used to have when finals were crashing down and she'd forget to breathe. "You're safe now," he said. "I've got you. We're going to get through this." And somehow, in the middle of a dark, unforgiving forest, Claire believed him. Claire's hands were still trembling when Luke lifted the duffel bag from her lap and slung it over his shoulder. She clung to the flashlight, its thin beam bouncing across the trees, but her eyes stayed locked on his face. She hadn't seen him in 12 years. Not since she told him she couldn't wait around for a man heading off to war zones when she wanted a quiet life in Boston. A life filled with antique shops, cozy coffee dates, and maybe someday a design studio of her own. But life didn't care about her plans. Life flipped her upside down in a crumpled sedan on a rainy Tuesday and never quite set her straight again. Luke was older now, weathered in a way that wasn't just age but experience. Deep lines carved around his eyes, a scar running down the right side of his jaw that hadn't been there before. His military posture hadn't softened, and his voice was still calm, measured, as if even here, in the middle of the woods, he was assessing threat levels. He didn't speak as he bent down beside her wheelchair, brushing debris from the wheels. His gaze flicked to her face, then to her lap, where she was gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. "I'm going to carry you," he said simply. "The trail back to my truck is 1/2 mile. The chair won't make it." Claire opened her mouth to protest, but he was already slipping the duffel bag behind him, bracing his stance. "I'm too heavy," she whispered, embarrassed. Luke shook his head. "I've carried 200-pound Marines through Afghan mountain passes. You're not too heavy." Before she could say another word, he moved behind her, slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her shoulders. He lifted her like it was second nature, like the years hadn't made them strangers. And as he stepped carefully through the underbrush, Claire's head fell against his shoulder more from exhaustion than trust. Though in that moment, she wasn't sure there was a difference. She wanted to ask questions, so many of them, but the forest seemed to hold its breath, and she didn't want to break the silence just yet. So she listened instead. To his steady breathing, to the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, to the wind whispering through pine branches above them like it had secrets to share. After a few minutes, her voice finally broke the quiet. "How did you find me?" Luke adjusted his grip slightly but kept walking. "I've been back in Boston about 2 months, working private security, consulting. Thought about looking you up, just to say hi. Then I saw some things online, posts about your accident, then nothing. No updates, no photos, just Grant playing the grieving brave husband on social media." Claire scoffed under her breath. "He loved that spotlight. I didn't like what I saw. Felt staged. So today, I decided to drive by your place. No real plan. Just instinct." "Soldier's instinct," she said softly. He glanced down at her, a flicker of a smile in the corner of his mouth. "Exactly." "You saw him put me in the SUV?" Luke nodded. He was acting strange, kept looking over his shoulder. "You looked confused, scared. I followed from a distance. Figured if I was wrong, I'd just turn around. But when he turned down this road, I knew something was off. I parked further up, came on foot." Claire swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "You watched him leave me?" "I did." His voice tightened. "I had to be sure he wasn't coming back, that you were really in danger. When I saw him drive off, that's when I moved in." She closed her eyes against the sting of shame. "He said he was taking me somewhere special." Luke's arms tightened slightly. He's going to answer for what he did. They walked on. The night grew colder, but Luke's body was warm against her, solid and unwavering. It reminded her of when they were younger, in college, when he used to walk her home from the library at night, carrying her books in one hand, holding her hand with the other. He'd always been the steady one, even back then. "How long have you had been out here?" she asked. "Bought it last year," he said. "After my last tour. I needed a place away from noise. Somewhere quiet, somewhere to think." Claire let that sit between them for a while. She could feel the weight in his voice, the kind of pain he didn't know how to talk about yet, the kind soldiers carried in their bones. "I never thought I'd see you again," she admitted. "Not like this." He gave a small humorless laugh. "Neither did I." When they finally broke through the trees, a black pickup truck sat tucked into a narrow path, hidden from the road. Claire's body relaxed. Just a little. The sight of something with seats and locks and headlights felt like rescue. Luke opened the passenger door, laid the blanket across the seat, and gently set her down. He moved quickly, adjusting her legs, tucking the edges of the blanket around her like she might disappear if left uncovered. It was precise, respectful. Nothing like the cold, dismissive way Grant had handled her body the past year, like she was a chore to be checked off a list. He climbed into the driver's seat, glanced over at her. "We're 20 minutes from the cabin. Heat, water, first aid. You'll be safe there." Claire nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As they pulled away, she stared out the window, watching the forest slip past in the rearview mirror. "Did you ever think we'd end up like this?" she asked after a long pause. "Me in a chair, you pulling me out of a forest like some damned movie hero." Luke kept his eyes on the road. "No, but if I had to be anywhere tonight, I'm glad it was here, with you." She turned to him then, really looked at him. The man beside her wasn't the boy she'd once loved. He was something more now, shaped by war, by loss, maybe even by regret. But beneath the armor, she still saw him. Still saw the way his eyes softened when they met hers. "Thank you," she whispered. He reached over and gave her hand a quick squeeze. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We're not done. We're just getting started." Claire leaned back into the seat, her body aching, her mind spinning, but for the first time in a long time, something sparked in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of it. The tires crunched over gravel as Luke turned onto a narrow driveway barely wide enough for his truck. Trees arched above them, their branches catching what little moonlight filtered through, creating flickers of silver across the windshield. At the end of the road stood a small cabin, its wooden exterior dark against the night, tree, but warm light glowed faintly from the windows. The sight made Claire's chest tighten with something she couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or disbelief. That she was safe. That someone had found her. That someone still cared enough to carry her out of hell without hesitation. Luke parked close to the front steps and hurried out. The door creaked open and light spilled out, revealing the porch and a ramp she hadn't noticed before. Sturdy, wide, clearly intentional. He returned to her side, gently lifting her from the passenger seat and carrying her up to the door without a word. Once inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. Wood-burning stove in the corner, logs crackling. The cabin smelled of cedar and something faintly citrus. Clean, comforting. Claire let herself be set down on a cushioned armchair by the fire, a handmade quilt folded across the back. She ran her hand across the upholstery. It was soft, worn in places. Lived in, not staged. Everything about the space whispered quiet, safety, solitude. A far cry from the sterile, polished world Grant had insisted on maintaining at home, where everything had to be Instagram-ready, even while she fell apart. Luke crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "You warm enough?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, thank you." He rose and moved toward the kitchenette, opening cabinets, pulling down mugs, boiling water on the stove. His movements were precise, practiced, like he'd done this 100 times before. There was a rhythm to it, like a soldier going through familiar drills. Claire's eyes wandered around the room. The furniture was simple, but solid. A low bookshelf filled with well-worn novels, a rifle rack bolted to the wall, framed photos, most of them scenic shots of forests, mountains, rivers. But one photo stood out. On the mantel. She squinted. It was a picture of them. College. A fall festival. She was sitting on his shoulders, laughing, leaves tangled in her hair. She hadn't seen that photo in years. Luke returned with a steaming mug and handed it to her. Chamomile. She didn't ask how he knew that had always been her favorite. She took a sip, the warmth sliding down her throat. "You kept that picture," she said quietly, nodding toward the mantel. He didn't look over. "Yeah. You never deleted me." "No." She looked down at the cup. "I thought you moved on. I mean, you disappeared after I ended things. No calls, no emails." "I was angry," he admitted. "But not at you, at myself. I thought if I made it easier for you to forget me, it hurt less, for both of us." Claire didn't know what to say to that. So she didn't. Luke sat in the armchair across from her, stretching his legs toward the fire. His boots were still dusted with dirt from the forest. His sleeves were pushed up, revealing forearms marked with small scars, stories untold. "I had this place modified after I got out," he said after a moment. "Didn't know if I'd be walking again. The injury wasn't as bad as they feared, but for a few months it was uncertain. So I had ramps put in, widened the doorways, added grab bars." Claire blinked. "You were injured?" He nodded. "Third tour, Middle East, bad op. Things went sideways. We lost 3 men. I took a hit, shrapnel along the spine. They patched me up, sent me home with medals and a limp." She stared at him, stunned. "I didn't know. Wasn't something I posted about," he said with a dry smile. Claire set her cup down, hands folded tightly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm here. Still breathing. Some aren't." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. She looked at him, really looked. This wasn't just Luke, the college boy who used to write her bad poetry and bring her coffee at 2 a.m. during finals. This was someone who'd seen war, buried friends, faced death and come back quieter, harder, but somehow kinder too. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up," she said. "If you hadn't been there." "I was meant to be," he replied simply. She laughed, not unkindly. "That sounds like fate." He shrugged. "Or unfinished business." Claire leaned back in the chair, watching the flames dance in the stove. "Grant used to say he loved me no matter what, in sickness and in health, all of that." Her voice grew tight. But after the accident, it wasn't long before the resentment set in. He'd sigh when he helped me transfer, complain about the costs. Then he convinced me to sign over the business so I could focus on recovery, said he'd just manage things temporarily. Luke's jaw tightened. He took control, bit by bit, changed passwords, stopped inviting people over. He made me feel like I was lucky just to be alive, like I owed him for not leaving sooner. "You don't owe him anything." "I know that now," she whispered. Luke stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a first aid kit. "You in pain?" "Always," she said, trying to smile through it. He handed her some over-the-counter meds and a glass of water. I'll pick up your prescriptions in the morning. You stay here as long as you need. Claire hesitated. I don't want to be a burden. You're not. Her eyes met his and something passed between them, an old, buried warmth resurfacing, but neither of them said it. Not yet. I should call the police, she murmured, glancing toward her purse. Not tonight, Luke said gently. Rest first. You've been through hell. We'll figure out the legal stuff tomorrow, but not when you're this raw. Claire exhaled slowly. He was right. He helped her to the bedroom, small, tidy, with flannel sheets already turned down. He handed her one of his old t-shirts and sweatpants. She changed with his help, noting how his touch was careful, not awkward, not pitying, just respectful. When she was finally lying down, he lingered in the doorway. If you need anything, he said, even just water, or if the pain gets bad, just call out. I'll hear. She nodded. Thank you, Luke. He turned to go, then paused. Claire? Yeah? You're not broken, just hurt, and hurt things can heal. She didn't respond, but she watched him go, the soft sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. And as the firelight flickered across the ceiling and her body finally began to relax, a strange thought crept into her mind. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning. And for the first time in over a year, she closed her eyes and felt safe. Claire didn't remember falling asleep, but the morning light crept through the curtains gently, not like the harsh beams of hospital fluorescents or the stinging exposure of courtroom spotlights she used to imagine in nightmares. The smell of brewing coffee reached her before she even opened her eyes. For a moment, she forgot where she was, until the stiffness in her back, the dull ache in her shoulders, and the hollow weight of everything that had happened came rushing back in a flood. She blinked, staring at the ceiling of the cabin's bedroom, watching sunlight spill in uneven lines across the wooden beams. The faint hum of a kettle boiling and the occasional clinking of silverware let her know she wasn't alone. Luke. Her heart beat with a strange rhythm at the thought. She shifted slightly and winced. The pain was building, nagging, persistent, the kind she'd learned to live with but never quite ignore. She called out, her voice rough. Luke? Almost instantly she heard footsteps. The door opened and Luke stepped in, holding a steaming mug. Morning, he said, offering the cup with a small smile. You made it through the night. Claire sat up slowly, gritting her teeth, and accepted the mug. Barely, she muttered with a smirk. Everything hurts. I found some basic painkillers. Not as strong as what you're used to, but they'll take the edge off. Thanks. He stepped out again, giving her privacy while she took the pills and adjusted her posture. When she wheeled herself into the living room 10 minutes later, he had already laid out a small breakfast. Eggs, toast, slices of apple. A blanket was draped over the couch, and her purse sat on the coffee table. You went back, she said quietly, staring at it. I did, Luke replied, pouring her a glass of water. First light. I didn't want to leave it there. It had your medication, your ID. I figured it might be important if we're going to the police. She took a deep breath, nodding. I should have done this sooner. Luke crouched beside her. You weren't ready. That's not weakness, Claire. That's survival. She turned to look at him. How do we even start? Grant's already crafting his story. He probably told the police I wandered off, that I was having an episode. I've seen him lie with a straight face. Luke stood, crossed the room, and retrieved his phone from the kitchen counter. We don't start alone. We call people who know how to fight this fight. He tapped the screen and held the phone to his ear. A few minutes later, a dark SUV pulled up outside the cabin. From it emerged a tall man with military precision in his movements, and a woman with a leather briefcase and an air of quiet authority. Luke opened the door. Claire, this is Jack Mercer, former investigator, now works in private security, and Rebecca Lynn, an attorney who specializes in domestic abuse and financial coercion. Rebecca extended a hand. It's good to meet you, Claire. I've been briefed on the basics. I'm here to listen and help however I can. Claire took a shaky breath and gestured toward the couch. All right, let's get to it. For the next hour, she talked. She told them everything. How the accident had happened 3 years ago, how she'd fought her way through rehab, how Grant had been the perfect husband in public and a stranger in private. She detailed how he gradually took over her business, changed her passwords, limited her access to funds, how he stopped inviting friends over, how her calls to her brother in Seattle became less frequent. Not because she didn't want to talk, but because Grant always had a reason why now wasn't a good time. She recounted the moment she signed the temporary power of attorney, how Grant had smiled as he held her hand. She didn't cry. Rebecca took notes the entire time, her face calm but focused. Jack typed silently beside her, occasionally nodding. When Claire finished, there was a heavy silence. Then Rebecca looked up. What you just described is a textbook case of coercive control. Financial abuse, emotional isolation, and now attempted abandonment. Possibly even attempted murder. Claire's voice was hoarse. Do you think they'll believe me? Rebecca's eyes softened. It's not about belief. It's about proof. And I think we can find it. Jack opened a laptop and set it on the table. Do you have any accounts Grant doesn't know about? Any old email addresses, backups, cloud drives? Claire thought for a moment. I have an old Gmail from college. I haven't used it in years, but I might have backed up business records there before the accident. Perfect, Jack said, already typing. Let's see if we can get in. It took some effort, but eventually Claire accessed the account. There, buried beneath years of old drafts and client correspondence, were PDFs of contracts, financial statements, and emails that clearly listed her as the owner and creative lead of Morgan Design Studio. Jack whistled softly. That's gold. This proves the business was yours before the accident. If we compare this with the documents he filed in the last 2 years, we'll be able to show he took control illegally. Rebecca nodded. We'll also want to document your medical needs, how he left you without essential medication or mobility devices. That strengthens the attempted murder case. Claire looked down at her hands. He'll say I told him to leave, that we argued, that I needed space. Jack opened his briefcase and pulled out a small voice recorder. Did he call or text after he left you? Claire picked up her phone, which had finally charged. Notifications flooded the screen. Texts, missed calls, voicemails. Luke moved beside her, jaw tense. Let's play them. Claire tapped the first message. Grant's voice poured out, calm and composed. Claire, I don't know where you went, but I'm worried. Please call me. You've been acting different. I think we need to get you some help. Rebecca rolled her eyes. There it is. He's already establishing a narrative. The second voicemail came next. This one was angrier. You need to stop this. If you don't answer, I'll have no choice but to report you missing. I've told the police you've been unstable lately. They're already looking. Claire's hands shook. He's painting me as mentally unwell. Rebecca leaned forward. That may actually help us. If he's reported you missing, and we show up with you alive and well, and evidence that he abandoned you, it destroys his credibility. Jack added, and we can get ahead of it with a recorded statement. Controlled, calm, factual. You speak directly to the camera. No drama, just truth. Claire hesitated. Me? On video? Luke rested a hand gently on her arm. You're stronger than you think. Rebecca nodded. People need to see you, hear your voice, see the contrast between what he's saying and who you really are. Claire took a deep breath. I'll do it. Luke stood. I'll set up the space. The cabin's den was cleared. Jack adjusted the lighting and Rebecca positioned the camera. Claire sat upright in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. Rebecca counted down with her fingers. 3, 2, 1. Claire looked into the lens and began. My name is Claire Morgan. 2 nights ago, my husband left me in the woods, alone, without my wheelchair, without my medication, without any way to survive. Her voice was clear, measured, firm. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a moment of panic or confusion. It was planned. It followed years of control, gaslighting, and slow erasure of who I used to be. But I survived, and I am not going to be silent anymore. She paused, holding the gaze of the camera as if it were Grant himself. My body may be limited, but my voice is not. As she finished, the room was still. Rebecca clicked the stop button. Perfect, she said. Let's make sure the world hears it. Claire looked down at her lap. Then up at Luke. Something inside her had shifted, no longer just the woman who'd been left behind. Now, she was someone who'd lived through the worst night of her life and stepped out of the woods with her head held high. It was only the beginning. But it was a damn good start. The sun was beginning to slide behind the trees when the knock came at the cabin door. Luke opened it before anyone else could react. Outside stood a compact woman in a dark coat, short dark hair tucked neatly behind her ears, eyes sharp but not unkind. "Detective Morales," she said, holding up her badge. "You must be Claire Morgan." Claire nodded from her place in the wheelchair. "Thank you for coming." Morales stepped inside, giving the room a quick sweep with her eyes. She took in Jack's equipment, Rebecca's briefcase, Claire's posture, Luke's protective stance. She didn't miss a thing. Then she turned to Claire fully. "I've reviewed the video statement," Morales said. "Miss Lynn briefed me. Before we make anything official, I want to hear your version of the story, in your own words." Claire took a breath. She didn't hesitate. She recounted everything, from the moment Grant said he had a surprise to the moment she saw his taillights vanish through the trees. She told her story without trembling, without flinching. She described the blanket, the flashlight, the tone of his voice when he said, "You're not the woman I married anymore." Luke sat silently nearby, his eyes on Morales the entire time. When Claire finished, Morales turned to Luke. "And you witnessed the abandonment?" "I did," he said clearly. "I followed them out of concern. I saw Grant leave her. I waited to make sure he wasn't coming back. Then I intervened." Morales narrowed her eyes slightly. "You just happened to be watching?" "I'm a former Special Forces operator," Luke said evenly. "I know what to look for. I've seen people hiding abuse behind polite smiles. Something felt wrong. I trusted my instincts." She didn't challenge him further. Instead, she turned back to Claire. "Your husband reported you missing early this morning, claimed you'd been emotionally unstable, possibly suicidal, said he last saw you the night before when you asked for space." Claire felt a flash of cold in her chest. "He's building his story." Morales gave a nod. "He's been giving interviews to local stations, tearful, very concerned husband. But we pulled phone records, GPS data. His timeline has inconsistencies." Rebecca stepped in. "Do we have enough to move on him?" Morales met her gaze. "We do. I've already obtained search warrants. Officers are at the Morgan residence and his office right now. If they find what we expect, hidden accounts, insurance records, communication with his assistant, we'll bring him in before midnight." Claire felt the ground shift under her. "It's really happening." Morales gave her a measured look. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" "I want him charged," Claire said, her voice steady, "for what he did to me and what he tried to take." The detective nodded. "Then we'll make sure the evidence sticks." As Morales left to coordinate with her team, Luke returned to Claire's side. He knelt down, resting a hand lightly on her knee. "You okay?" "I think so," she said, exhaling, for the first time in a long while. The rest of the evening moved fast. Jack confirmed the financial trail. Grant had been draining Claire's accounts and funneling the funds into offshores. He'd also discovered damning emails. Grant corresponding with Rachel Knox, his assistant, discussing the long game, the freedom ahead, and final steps. Morales returned after midnight with an update. "He's in custody. We got him mid-transfer. He was moving large sums when we walked in." Claire closed her eyes at the news, overwhelmed. Luke stood behind her, resting his hands on the back of her chair, solid and still. She reached up, placed her fingers over his, and for a moment, they both just breathed. Later, in the quiet hours of early morning, Claire couldn't sleep. She wheeled herself to the wide window that faced the forest, the same woods where she had been left to die. Outside, the trees stood silent, watchful. But tonight, they weren't sinister. They were witnesses. Guardians. Luke joined her quietly, holding 2 mugs. "Tea?" he offered. She accepted with a soft smile. "Always." They sipped in silence. Then she spoke. "You said earlier this might be unfinished business. Between us? Did you mean it?" Luke looked down into his mug. "I never really stopped thinking about you." Claire turned her face toward him. "Even after I walked away? You wanted stability. I wanted war zones. You were right to walk. But yeah, I thought about you, especially after my injury, when they said I might not walk again. I thought, maybe this is what she felt." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Then, I was angry at you for leaving so easily. But now I think maybe I was just scared. I needed someone who wouldn't leave me when things got hard." "I'm not leaving this time," Luke said simply. She looked down at her hands. "This doesn't fix everything. I'm still processing, still hurting. I don't know what comes next." Luke nodded. "I'm not here for the version of you that's all put together. I'm here for whatever version shows up, every day. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. Instead, she said softly, then stay. For now. He reached over, his fingers brushing hers. I'm not going anywhere. By dawn, Claire had made her decision. She would give her formal statement at the station. She would face Grant in court, surrounded by the truth he'd tried so hard to bury. She would rebuild what he tried to take, her independence, her business, her voice. And she would not do it alone. As the light crept across the cabin walls, painting them gold, Claire felt something stir in her chest, not just relief, not just closure, but a seed of something she hadn't felt in far too long. Hope. It would not be easy, but it would be hers. The courtroom was colder than Claire expected, not in temperature, but in tone, sterile, methodical, stripped of humanity. Polished wood, hard benches, murmurs of legal jargon bouncing off the high ceilings. It was nothing like the chaotic nightmare she'd lived through in that forest. And yet, this sterile room now held the weight of her future. It had been 6 long months since that night. 6 months of pain, of therapy, emotional and physical. 6 months of gathering evidence, giving statements, sitting in meetings with Rebecca, with Jack, with the district attorney's office. 6 months of watching her former husband parade around the media like a wounded man trying to bring his broken wife home. And now, here she sat. Claire Morgan, no longer the woman who had to be carried from the woods, no longer the passive recipient of pity. Today, she was testifying. Luke sat beside her at the front row of the courtroom gallery, his presence a silent anchor. He wore a suit, something more formal than she'd seen him in, but he still radiated that steady strength she'd come to rely on. His hand was on her armrest, a quiet reminder, you're not alone. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Claire tried to steady her breath. Then came the defense team. Grant's attorney, Carter Blackwell, a man whose reputation for shredding victims in court was known across the state. Tall, silver-haired, smug. And there, just behind him, walked Grant himself. Clean-shaven in a tailored navy suit, expression unreadable. Not the man who had left her in the forest to die, but the man who pretended to love her in front of cameras. The concerned husband, the wrongly accused. Claire's stomach twisted. But she sat up straighter. Let him look. Let him see who she was now. The prosecution called witnesses. Financial experts testified first, Jack among them, outlining the embezzlement, the hidden transfers, the offshore accounts in Grant's name. Then came a forensic accountant who showed how the business had been systematically stripped from Claire after her accident, how her digital identity had been slowly overwritten by her husband's hands. Then, a doctor, her own neurologist, explained the medication Claire needed to survive. He explained how missing a dose could lead to dangerous spikes in pain, blood pressure, and potential seizures. He confirmed that being left in a forest without mobility, medication, or access to help posed a serious risk of death. Then it was Claire's turn. The bailiff helped her wheel into position. Rebecca stood beside her, microphones adjusted. The room fell quiet. Claire looked directly at the jury. 12 people, men and women, young and old. Some leaned forward, others looked skeptical. All of them waited. She began. I didn't grow up thinking I'd end up here, she said softly. I believed in hard work, in marriage, in building something together. I believed Grant Morgan was my partner in life. She took a breath. When I had the accident, I thought the hardest part would be learning to live in a wheelchair. I didn't realize the real pain would come from the person who was supposed to love me. Grant didn't push me down a flight of stairs. He didn't strike me or scream. He smiled. He handled things. He isolated me slowly, with paperwork and passwords and polite condescension. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. It rang with quiet steel. He left me in the woods because he thought no one would believe me, because I was already erased. He nearly succeeded. She paused, looked directly at Grant. But I survived, and I am done being erased. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Not even Blackwell spoke for a full 5 seconds. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and began his cross-examination. The questions came quickly. Isn't it true you suffered from post-accident depression? Didn't you once miss a therapy appointment? Didn't you tell your husband you felt like a burden? Claire answered every one. Calmly, firmly. Yes, I was depressed. I was grieving the life I lost. But that doesn't mean I hallucinated being left in a forest. No, I didn't go to that appointment. I was sick. My chart confirms it. Yes, I felt like a burden, because he made me feel that way. That doesn't make abandonment acceptable. And then, in a moment that caught even Rebecca by surprise, Claire leaned slightly forward and added, "Let me ask you, Mr. Blackwell, if someone leaves a healthy, able-bodied adult in a forest with no car, no cell signal, no food, no shelter, what do we call that? Now imagine doing it to a disabled woman without her wheelchair or medication. What would you call it?" Blackwell hesitated. "I'll help you," Claire continued. "It's called attempted murder." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged her gavel. "That's enough, Miss Morgan," she said, but not unkindly. Claire returned to her seat, chest rising and falling. Luke met her with a proud, unspoken smile. The next day, the defense called Grant to the stand. He performed well, calm, polished, choking up at just the right moments. "I was overwhelmed," he said. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just needed space. I didn't think she was in danger." He glanced toward the jury often, eyes wide with regret, but the final nail came when the prosecution entered the recovered emails. One message between Grant and Rachel read, "Once the paperwork clears, she won't have any say in the business. I'll have full control. We'll be free. Just hold on." Another read, "It's not murder if she wanders off. She gets confused sometimes. We could say she was just trying to clear her head. No one would question it." The courtroom froze. Grant paled. His lawyer looked like he'd swallowed glass. The jury took just 4 hours to deliberate. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of financial fraud, guilty. On the charge of domestic abuse, guilty. Claire didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply exhaled and felt for the first time in years like her lungs had space to expand again. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters shouted her name. Rebecca shielded her, speaking firmly on her behalf. Claire and Luke exited through the side door. In the parking lot, Claire turned her face to the wind. It was cool, crisp, and clean. For once, she wasn't escaping. She was stepping into something new. "You did it," Luke said. "No," she said, reaching for his hand. "We did it." He helped her into the passenger seat. As he circled around to drive, Claire looked out the window at the courthouse behind her. Once a place of judgment, now a symbol of justice. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to finding out. The office space still smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. Claire stood just inside the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the arm of her wheelchair, taking in the polished floors, the wide entryway, the light that poured in through oversized windows. Her name wasn't on the wall yet, but the logo for her new business, Elevation Access, was etched in frosted glass behind the reception desk, clear and proud. It was hers. All of it. The lease, the design, the mission. Not borrowed, not shared, not stolen. 6 months had passed since the courtroom doors closed behind her ex-husband. His sentencing had been swift. 10 years, no parole. Fraud, attempted murder, coercive control. The charges hadn't been easy to prove, but with Rebecca's help, and the mountain of evidence Luke, Jack, and Morales had uncovered, justice had finally caught up to him. In the aftermath, Claire hadn't collapsed like everyone expected. She didn't retreat into silence or disappear into grief. Instead, she'd taken a long, deep breath and asked herself the question that had been quietly growing since the night Luke carried her out of the woods. What now? The answer came quickly. She'd spent the better part of 3 years being told she wasn't enough, that her disability was a burden, that her business couldn't survive without Grant. But she'd survived far worse. And she'd done it with the help of people who believed in her. Now it was her turn to pass that belief forward. Elevation Access was a consulting firm that helped businesses make their spaces inclusive, not just ADA compliant, but genuinely welcoming to people of all abilities. She'd hired 2 full-time staff already, one visually impaired UX specialist and one deaf operations coordinator, fluent in ASL. More hires were coming. They'd booked their first 2 clients last week. She wheeled further into the office, running her fingers along the edge of the conference room table. Everything had been chosen with intention: warm lighting, sliding glass doors, adjustable height desks. Not just accessible, but beautiful. It felt like a reclamation, not just of space, but of her own voice. Behind her, the door opened with a soft chime. Luke stepped in, wearing his usual Henley and dark jeans, a coffee in each hand. He smiled when he saw her, the kind of quiet, private smile that had grown more familiar these past few months, the one he gave only to her. "Did I miss the ribbon cutting?" he asked, handing her the cup. She took it, grateful. "You're just in time." He looked around the space, nodding with quiet admiration. "It's exactly how you described it." "Better," she replied. "It's real." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping coffee and listening to the faint hum of the building waking up around them. Outside, traffic buzzed. Inside, the future felt wide open. Claire broke the quiet. "I've been thinking about moving into the city full-time." Luke turned toward her, raising an eyebrow. "Really? I love the cabin. I always will. It saved me. But I want to be closer to the office, closer to life." He didn't try to mask the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Makes sense. I was hoping," she said gently, "that maybe you'd come with me." He blinked. "To the city? To somewhere new?" she clarified. "Together." Luke didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched beside her chair, their eyes level. "You sure?" "I'm not the same woman you carried out of those woods," she said. "I'm stronger now, clearer, but I still want to build something, with someone. I don't need saving. I need a partner." He reached for her hand. "Then I'm in, wherever you go." They stayed like that for a while. No declarations, no drama, just a quiet commitment, the kind that lasts. Later that day, they met Rebecca for lunch, where she shared news about the civil case against Rachel Knox. Claire would be receiving damages, not just for the business Grant stole, but for the emotional and physical trauma she endured. Money couldn't rewrite the past, but it could fund a powerful future. Back at the office, Claire reviewed the next client pitch with her team. A historic theater downtown wanted to redesign their space to accommodate guests with disabilities. Ramps, seating, restrooms, and backstage access for performers. Claire felt her heart swell. She remembered the girl she'd been, the one who used to design dream homes and sketchbooks. Now she was designing futures for people who had been forgotten. She was using her pain as blueprint. That night, she and Luke sat on the balcony of their temporary apartment overlooking the skyline. The air was cool. City sounds drifted up from below. Horns, laughter, a distant dog barking. Claire rested her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel this peaceful," she murmured. Luke ran his fingers lightly along the back of her hand. "You earned it." She turned to look at him. "You know, for a long time, I thought I was weak for staying, for not speaking up sooner." "You weren't weak," he said firmly. "You were surviving. Now you're thriving." Claire nodded slowly. "It still hurts sometimes, the things he said, the way I doubted myself." "It'll echo for a while," he said. "But you've built something stronger now. Every time you help someone walk through a door that used to be closed to them, literal or not, you're rewriting your story." She smiled, resting her head on his chest. "Thank you for walking through mine." He kissed her forehead, his voice low. "Always." As the lights of the city shimmered in the windows, Claire thought back to that night in the woods. The moment she believed she might die, discarded and voiceless. And she thought of everything since. The courage it took to speak, the fire it took to fight, the grace it took to rebuild. Her past had nearly buried her. But it had also built the foundation for the woman she was now. Not just a survivor, a leader. A voice for the silenced. And for the first time in a long time, as she looked out at the future unfolding before her, she didn't feel fear. She felt power. She felt ready. And above all, she felt free. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of Claire's powerful story. If you're still here, it means something in her journey touched your heart, and we're truly grateful for your time. Claire's experience reminds us that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's found in quiet resilience, in choosing to speak up after being silenced, in rebuilding your life one determined step at a time. We all face moments where we feel broken or forgotten, but as Claire showed us, healing is possible, and justice, when pursued with courage, can prevail. Where are you watching from today? We'd love to know. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Your story matters too, and we believe in building a community where voices like yours are heard and respected. If this story moved you, inspired you, or simply gave you hope, please subscribe to our channel. We have many more powerful stories on the way, stories of healing, redemption, and truth that deserve to be told. Don't miss them. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, your voice is stronger than you think.